Welcome back. This is the lecture after talking about integrated assessment models and climate change economics. So let's do a quick recap of where we are. We've after spring break we talked a bit about natural gas, and then we quickly jumped into welfare economics, where we outlined the externalities associated with energy production and consumption. The primary externality we're concerned with right now is carbon emissions, and then we spent a couple weeks figuring out how to estimate the externality costs associated with carbon emissions from energy production and consumption, and we did that using integrated assessment models, in particular the DICE model. And so you've all been working on estimating the DICE model and performing a sensitivity analysis to produce a social cost of carbon number. And that social cost of carbon should be the optimal tax on emissions. So that would be the first best policy to address emissions. We talked about three policies: a quota, cap and trade, a tax. And for the most part, those are first best policies. They directly address the emissions externality. But today we'll talk about what happens when we fail to implement the first best policy. So we saw last week that we've tried at a global scale to implement the first best policy. We've tried to address carbon emissions at a global scale, but we've pretty much failed, and that's because it's a huge public goods problem. So what happens when the first best policies fail? So we have to rely on second best policies. So what are second best policies? That's what this lecture is about today. Yeah, so we have an estimate of the social cost of carbon. What is the next step? So it turns out implementing a carbon tax is politically difficult. We haven't been able to do it, either in the US or for the most part across the globe. There are a couple countries that have carbon taxes, but it's very few and far between. So second best policies. Second best policies indirectly address the externality. They're used when no one is willing to implement the first best policy. So an example, externality is carbon emissions from energy production and consumption. Of course, that's our example we're talking about right now. The first best solution is to tax the carbon emissions. It's to directly, it's to address the problem head on. The second best solution is to implement policies that indirectly reduce emissions. So maybe we want to subsidize electric vehicle purchases. The idea there is that the policy is a subsidy for electric vehicles. And when people drive electric vehicles, hopefully that's going to reduce their emissions output. And we'll see in a couple of slides that may or may not be true. We might implement a policy that subsidizes renewable electricity production. This is a second best policy because if we have more renewable electricity production per state, we're going to reduce emissions, but we're not directly, the policy isn't aimed at reducing emissions directly. It's aimed at increasing renewable production. And a byproduct of increasing renewable production is that emissions are reduced, hopefully. It doesn't necessarily, so the problem with that maybe is that even if you increase renewable energy production, if demand for electricity goes up and that demand is met by the increased renewables, but we keep fossil fuel production the same, then emissions have not changed. So it's not guaranteed that emissions are going to go down using a subsidy for renewable electricity production. So you can see how that's not directly addressing the carbon externality. Here's another kind of funny example that I could think of just to hammer this home. Second best policies tend to partially address the problem, but end up creating more unintended problems of their own. That's kind of the takeaway from this. So for example, if we have too many dirty dishes in the country, we might, instead of taxing dirty dishes, that would be the economist's favorite solution, we might subsidize paper plates instead. So this would create a couple of additional problems. First, it's going to maybe solve the dirty dishes problem, because people are going to eat off paper plates and then just throw them away. So we have no more dirty dishes, but we now have a problem of a lot of extra waste. If everyone starts eating off of paper plates, then they're going to be throwing away a lot of paper plates, adding a lot more to our landfills. We might also see emissions from paper production go up because the demand for paper goes up. What are the goals of a carbon tax? Now, to bring this back to the carbon tax discussion, we want to reduce fossil fuel electricity production, reduce emissions from vehicles or vehicle miles traveled, and fuel economy, cause people to invest in more energy efficient appliances and vehicles, cause prices for emissions intensive products electricity to go up, leading to a decrease in consumption. A tax or a cap and trade program would achieve all of these things. That's a first best policy, directly addressing the emissions externality. If we simply increase the price of carbon intensive goods and services, then we're going to stop consuming those goods and services and start spending our money elsewhere. That's the point. But if a carbon tax is not feasible, what other policies can we use to achieve the same goals? These are the second best policies that potentially achieve the same goals, but typically they might only result in one of the previous desired outcomes from the previous slide. So electricity policies, we might have subsidies or tax credits for renewable production, renewable portfolio standards, high feed-in tariffs, net metering for solar, or demand-side policies. In the transportation sector, we might have CAFÉ standards, or renewable fuel standards, or subsidies for electric vehicles. And then we'll see smart energy systems at the end. What's a renewable portfolio standard? These are popular state-level policies. Electric retailers are required to purchase an increasing fraction of their generation from renewable generators. Okay, so generators using renewable sources receive 1 renewable energy credit for each megawatt hour of electricity produced. The fossil fuel retailers purchase these RECs from generators until they meet their state requirement. And the sale of these RECs provide an additional revenue source to renewable energy generators. This is essentially a cap and trade program where fossil fuel electricity generators have to purchase credits from renewable producers, and they have to show that the number of credits they produce is equal to a certain percentage of their production from fossil fuels. Here are, in 2017, the distribution of the renewable portfolio standards across the United States. The states in dark blue are the ones with renewable portfolio standards. You can see the Southeast and the kind of the middle of the United States does not have renewable portfolio standards, but other states do, and these are actually pretty out of date already. I know Colorado's has bumped up quite a lot. We're hoping to get to 100% renewable by 2100, maybe 2050. I'm not quite sure. Hawaii is hoping to get to 100% renewable by 2045. So you can see how these things play out. Feed-in tariffs, they're popular in Europe. These are fixed wholesale prices for renewable generation, typically set above the wholesale price in the market. So basically, if you're a renewable provider, you're guaranteed a certain price for your generation. And this price is higher than the average wholesale price for electricity. The additional costs of feed-in tariffs are passed on to electricity consumers through higher rates. So this is basically a subsidy paid by the consumers to renewable energy providers. Net metering. Net metering refers to how consumers with rooftop solar panels are compensated for the electricity they generate. For example, if you own solar panels on the top of your roof, you're probably not going to use all of the electricity that the solar panels are producing, especially because a lot of it's produced during the day when you're not home. So these policies allow households to sell that additional electricity back to the grid. The question, though, for policymakers is what price should the homeowners receive? And oftentimes they receive the retail electricity price. Now, is this fair? Imagine for a moment that you're a smart entrepreneur and you realize that homeowners with solar panels on their house can sell electricity onto the grid at retail prices. If you're a generator, a wholesale generator, you take the wholesale price, which is lower than the retail price a lot of the time. So what would you do? Well, you'd probably go out and rent a whole bunch of roofs in neighborhoods, thousands of houses, and ask them if they would be willing to let you put solar panels on their homes. And in compensation, the household gets the energy from the solar panel when they want it, and you, the owner of the solar panels, get to sell the electricity back to the grid, the excess electricity back to the grid at retail prices. So this is called third-party owned systems, and they're popping up around the country, and it's basically a distributed wholesaler that's renting out residential roofs. Okay, in the transportation sector, we have CAFÉ standards. What are CAFÉ standards? They're average fuel economy standards for the fleet of vehicles in the U.S. This means that on average, you can see these are the CAFÉ standards from 1973 or 4 all the way, oh wait, no, that would be 76 or 77 all the way to 2020. These are the realized CAFÉ standards, the realized average miles per gallon, not the actual standards, but remember, these were implemented in response to the Yom Kippur War and the Arab oil embargo from 1973. And so what these are is basically a requirement that the average vehicle on the road has to have a certain mile per gallon. And you can see the black line for the total fleet that jumped from 20 in 1976 or so to 25 around 1980, and it's up to about 33 or 34 nowadays. Domestic cars are higher and light trucks are lower. Renewable fuel standards. We have one of these. We have a couple of these actually. California has its own. We have a nationwide one. It's called the RFS. It's a program that requires transportation fuel sold in the United States to contain a minimum volume of renewable fuels. It originated with the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and was expanded and extended by the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. I put that in there mainly to give you the dates that these started, 2005 and 2007. What are these things? It's the policy that mandates that your fuel, your gasoline or diesel, is blended with some portion of renewable fuel. So this is why the gasoline at the pump has a sticker on it that says fuel contains 10% ethanol. One of the problems with these is that they're not really shown to be beneficial because ethanol actually doesn't have lower emissions than gasoline. If we're talking about life cycle emissions from growing corn, plowing crops, etc., it turns out that ethanol is not actually more beneficial than gasoline. So we're not really doing any favors by mandating that our gasoline contains a portion of ethanol. How about subsidies for electric vehicles? How environmentally friendly are these vehicles in general? So subsidies for electric vehicles are pretty good, but we have to consider where you're driving the electric vehicle. So if you're interested, you can go take a look at this paper by Zivin, Kachin, and Mansour. They attempt to answer this question: how environmentally friendly are electric vehicles? Their first point is that electric vehicles are only as clean as the fuel used to produce the energy that the electric vehicles are being charged with. That seems kind of obvious, but a lot of people don't think about this. You think electric vehicles are emissions free, but of course the electricity comes from somewhere. These guys develop a method for estimating marginal emissions from electricity demand that varies by location and time of day across the United States. They find that the marginal emissions rates in the Midwest are more than 3 times those on the West Coast, and emissions rates for certain hours are more than twice the rates for other hours. So what they're saying here is that if you charge your electric vehicle in the Midwest, the emissions from doing so are more than 3 times those than charging an electric vehicle on the West Coast. Why? Because charging in the Midwest, the electricity is largely produced from coal. And it turns out that charging electric vehicle where the electricity is produced from coal actually can have higher emissions than just simply burning a gasoline-powered vehicle or running a gasoline-powered vehicle. Likewise, the emissions depend on the hours of the day that you're charging. And we've talked about this in the beginning of the semester, but we know that the base load, the amount that, or the electricity that's generated to provide the base load, or what we might consider the marginal emissions at night, is going to be potentially dirtier or cleaner than the peak load emissions, depending on what the base load source is. So if the base load source is coal, then it's going to be dirtier to charge your electric vehicle at night than if the base load source of emissions is like nuclear or something, or hydro. So I encourage you, if you're curious about this, take a look at this paper and go back to the beginning of the electricity section of this course. Demand-side policies are another way we could reduce emissions or electricity or water consumption. The idea here is, how do we get people to make more efficient choices? Well, we have 2 options. We can adjust prices. We've already talked a lot about one of these, real-time pricing in electricity markets. The question is, how well does this work? And the other option is social comparison. So we can rely on behavioral economics to give us some insights here. A quick example of behavioral economics. So there's a paper in which airline pilots were given several interventions to see if the airlines could incentivize them to be more efficient. So the interventions were informing captains they are involved in a study, they are being watched, so simply just telling them that they're being watched, providing personalized feedback on the previous month's fuel efficiency, providing targets and feedback on fuel efficiency in the upcoming month, providing a $10 donation to a charity of the captain's choice for each of the 3 behavioral targets met. Which do you think will be will have the most influence on behavior? Think about that. Pause the slide and answer the question in your head. So the results were: just informing captains they were involved in a study increased fuel efficiency. So just knowing they were being watched, like the Big Brother effect, increased fuel efficiency. Tailored information with targets resulted in 9 to 20% more efficient taxiing and in-flight practices, and donations to charities had no effect. This resulted in cost savings of $5.37 million in fuel savings and 21,500 metric tons of CO2 saved over 8 months. So that's quite a lot just by giving this. So the savings are huge relative to the cost of the intervention, which is just giving tailored information. So the question is, why aren't we doing this more often? So these non-price energy conservation programs are informed by behavioral economics. We attempt to nudge people toward energy efficiency by removing behavioral or cognitive barriers. Examples include default retirement savings plans. Typically, when people start a job, they enter the default retirement savings plan. The problem is that this isn't necessarily the best savings plan for everyone, but we don't go out and change our saving plans because it takes effort. Appeals to social norms, we'll see one of those in a moment. Peer effects, we'll also see one of those, or social comparison, and commitment contracts. These have all been effective in settings ranging from electricity use, exercise, weight loss, retirement savings, smoking, and water conservation. This paper by Allcott in 2011, called Social Norms and Energy Conservation, is probably the most famous behavioral economics type study that has been performed. It's what it is a company called Opower mailed home energy report letters that compare a household's energy use to that of similar neighbors and provide energy conservation tips. The hypothesis is that providing social comparisons directly affects energy consumption, or people respond to being compared to their neighbors. The experiment is a randomized controlled trial over 47 utilities in 21 states. That's a gigantic randomized controlled trial. It's the biggest that I know of. Over 600,000 houses in the treatment and control groups. It's huge. So the treatment is randomly selecting houses to receive letters with information and social comparisons. Utilities include states in California, Washington, the Midwest, Northeast, and one in the mountain states. Why are these being done? It makes no sense for the utility to induce households to conserve. Why? Because the more electricity people consume, the more revenue the utilities generate. So why would they want to do this? Well, often energy efficiency is mandated by policymakers through energy efficiency resource standards. Households receive letters with two pieces of information. One is a social comparison, and two, an energy conservation tip. The social comparison is a normed-based message. Households receive a message describing how much they consume relative to similar neighbors. They also receive these smiley faces or frowny faces saying they're doing great relative to your neighbors, or their neighbors, or they're consuming more than their neighbors. They also receive actionable tips, so conservation tips to reduce electricity consumption. For example, if households use relatively large amounts of energy in the summer, they receive information on efficient AC settings in AC units. The results, the average treatment effect, ATE, ranges from 1.37% electricity reduction to 3.32% electricity reduction across the different states. This means that just receiving this social comparison on average reduces electricity consumption by 1.37% to 3.32%. So that's pretty good. It's not a ton per household, but if you add that up across all houses in the study, or all houses in a utility service area or state, then you're going to get pretty substantial reductions in electricity usage. Experiment 11, also they gave the messages more frequently. So the more frequent messaging increased the treatment effect by 0.5%. So this is often referred to as a salience sort of thing. If you only receive this message every month or every other month or quarterly, you're not going to remember it. But if you receive it more frequently, then you're going to respond. It's going to be more fresh in your mind, so you're more likely to respond. We also performed similar experiments in Fort Collins on electricity and water consumption. If you live here in Fort Collins, you probably get some of these letters that tell you how much electricity or water you're consuming relative to your neighbors. I evaluated the results of these experiments and found that these treatments reduced water consumption by and electricity consumption by approximately 2% on average. So about the same effect as what Allcott found across the entire US. In conclusion, social comparisons cause people to conserve energy over the billing cycle. So this is the billing cycle being over the month or 2 months, whatever your billing cycle is. But what about specific times of the day? What if we want to curtail the peak period load? Okay, so this is a paper called Experimental Evidence on the Role of Information and Pricing on Residential Electricity Consumption. I wrote it with Ken Gillingham there in the middle and Praveen Gopal on the right-hand side. And that's the question we're trying to answer. So we've seen evidence that electricity consumers respond to information and social norm comparisons over long periods, the billing cycle. But we know a key issue for utilities is smoothing consumption over the course of the day. In other words, reducing peak hour consumption. We've talked a lot about this. Residential electricity prices don't usually respond to wholesale prices and thus are disconnected from the marginal cost of generation. So therefore, we're consuming too much during the peak hours. The study design, we have a randomized controlled trial in Austin, Texas. We study the effect of 4 different treatments. We give people an online portal. Basically, they can see what their real-time electricity use and the price they're paying for that electricity is. The participants in this study were on a tiered pricing system, so they basically paid a flat retail price. The second intervention was a text message with behavioral change suggestions. So we want to get the people to reduce their electricity consumption on the hottest days between 4 and 7 p.m., the peak period. And so we might provide a text message that says at the beginning of the trial period, basically says you should pre-cool your home, crank up your AC at 3 p.m., for example, and then turn down your AC during the peak period. And then we provide simple text messages with specific information. So the text message might read, the utility was called Pecan Street. A Pecan Street project critical peak pricing event is taking place tomorrow between 4 and 7 p.m. So it's a reminder to people to use less electricity tomorrow between 4 and 7 p.m. And then we had 2 alternative pricing structures. One is that we change prices from 33 cents per kilowatt hour to 64 cents per kilowatt hour during the peak hours between 4 and 7 p.m. And then we change prices to 6 cents per kilowatt hour during windy periods in the winter. So we have a simple provision of information, and then a text with suggestions, and then a text with more actionable messages telling you that the next day we would really like you to conserve electricity consumption, and then price changes. So the idea is, can we get households to reduce electricity consumption during particular hours of the day, and what days are most important? Really hot days in the summer when demand is at its highest. The utility uses temperature forecasts to target households on the forecasted days, so they're going to send these text messages the day before the really hot days, and then windy days when power is cheap, so that's during the winter. Here are the 4 groups relative to a control group. You can see this is during the control period, so this is not when any of the interventions are taking place. Basically, what we'd want to see here is that the consumption pattern over the course of the day is relatively similar between the treatment and control groups, and that's what we find. Here's what they look like during the treatment periods. So we remember we have one of these is the change in prices, one is access to an online portal, one is the simple text messages, and one is text message with take action request. Which one do you think is the one on the bottom right there, the one that looks like it has an effect, where the control group uses much more than the treated group during the peak period? So the peak period is the time between the vertical lines there. If you said change in prices, you would be right. So we found The people respond to a change in prices, but they basically don't respond to anything else. And what appliance is driving that change in use? Well, AC. So this is the graph of AC use for these treated and control groups for the pricing treatment. You can see that basically all of this effect is coming from reduction in AC use during the treatment period. What about windy periods? So we also lower prices for treatment groups for the treatment group from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. during March to May and October and November. So that's the time when most of the wind in Texas is being produced. This is the highest wind production periods in Texas. Okay, so this graph just shows the general the treatment effect during those periods. So the red is the group that's receiving the lower prices during the treatment period. So the treatment period is everything left of the first red bar there between midnight and 6 a.m. and everything to the right of the second red bar, which would be 10 p.m. onwards. So we can see that there's a shift in consumption for the treatment group, not just a reduction in consumption when prices are lowered during the nighttime period. So you see that the treated group is using more electricity just before 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. than the control group. The red line is higher than the green line prior to 6 a.m. But then after 6 a.m. the red line is lower than the green line, meaning that whatever those households are consuming, they shifted that consumption to the nighttime periods rather than the daytime periods. Where is that shift coming from? Electric vehicle charging. So a lot of the households in this study actually had electric vehicles, and we can see that basically all of that shift is coming from a change in the charging patterns of electric vehicles. So people will respond to price changes. Customers will respond to price incentives. Utilities can use price incentives to shift smooth consumption over the course of the day to reduce peak demand, and there's large implications for electric vehicle, charging in the future. So what is the future? The smart grid. What is a smart grid? The short answer is a smart grid is the electricity grid. I should probably have transportation in there, plus the internet. The traditional power grid looks something like this, where we have markets in operations or generation, and then transmission, then distribution. So the information flows one way in this setup. The smart grid, or the grid of the future, has information flowing both ways, a two-way flow of electricity and information. So electricity flows from the generators to the customers, but we could probably also see electricity flowing back from the households to the grid. So we can see electricity flowing both ways. We could see electricity flowing to the grid from residential solar panels or something like that. But we'd also see information flowing both ways. Right now, information flows from households to the generators, but as a household, you're not getting any information from the generators or from the grid. You're not responding to prices or what's happening in the wholesale market. So the smart grid is going to have the information flowing both ways as well. It's going to have prices, wholesale prices or more flexible retail prices being given to the residential and commercial consumers. So the smart grid is basically information and electricity flowing in every direction. To sum that up, information flows both ways. Customers receive real-time information on prices for each appliance. Utilities receive real-time information on demand. Appliances are controlled automatically by consumers and utilities, or we might see some things called aggregators. This would decrease the need for battery storage. If we can smooth the demand over the course of the day, we won't need as much battery storage. Hopefully, the smart grid includes battery storage, and we might have electric vehicles coordinated charging with divested car ownership. In other words, we might see fleets of electric vehicles that are owned by a company like Lyft or Uber, and they not only we'll see people not owning cars in the future and just purchasing rides in an electric vehicle owned by Lyft, but Lyft will then basically have a mobile battery storage unit. It's the cars, and they can be paid to fill up their batteries when the prices are low, and then they can even plug their cars back in and provide power to the grid when prices are high or during the peak period. So final thoughts on this topic. I would say it seems as though we're going to rely on second best policies to address carbon emissions. It doesn't seem like we're going to get a carbon tax anytime soon, especially not at a global scale. With any luck, these second best policies and the natural technological change in electricity and transportation infrastructure will lead to a better world.